This is the Building Automation Monthly Podcast with Phil Zito, episode 119. Hey folks, welcome to the Building Automation Monthly Podcast, and in this episode we are going to be talking about networking. So last episode we wrapped up the three-part BACnet series. That was episodes 116 through episodes 118. And after going through that episode, after seeing the comments and getting the questions from those episodes, noticed that there was a need for IT knowledge. There was this gap in understanding some of the concepts that folks needed to understand for BACnet IP, for BACnet in general, specifically around ports and how IP communication works. And there was just some general, I wouldn't say lack of understanding, but just gaps around basic IT concepts like servers and databases and things like that as well, because all of those things were used in the BACnet lessons for trend storage, for BACnet servers and workstations and things like that. So after sitting down and thinking and just kind of racking my brain here, came up with a couple episodes, may turn into a lot of episodes, where we're going to go through some solid IT concepts. You know, it's a shame. Outside of our course on IT, not quite sure what else is out there for BAS professionals. I mean, sure, there's sites like Pluralsight, which if you're ever going down the developer route where you're actually writing in-depth code, not programming for BAS, but I'm talking like actual coding in programming languages, then those sites are great, or advanced networking. But, you know, the stuff they teach is way more complicated than what an actual BAS person needs to know. So where is there outside of our course? And looking around, there really isn't anywhere. No one's talking about this. Everyone's all excited to do marketing and fluff articles about IoT and how analytics are going to change the world, and we don't have enough people and talent's leaving and blah 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 blah, but no one actually goes and solves the problem by teaching folks what they need to know. So that's what we're going to be going over in the next series of episodes. We're going to be diving deep into IT, but we're going to be doing it from the perspective of a BAS professional. So there's going to be a lot of segues. We're going to be teaching you IT concepts, and then after we go through those concepts, it's going to be actually explaining to you why that matters, or why maybe it doesn't matter for you as a BAS professional, because there's a lot of stuff that you can learn about IT that really doesn't matter for you as a BAS professional, and there's a lot of stuff that's being taught but not focused on that does matter for you. So what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to start off in the networking kind of area, because if you can't communicate data, you can have all the servers and databases and remote access setups in the world, but data communication, without that, nothing's going to happen. And with this kind of push for BACnet IP controllers that we're seeing happening more and more and more, that is requiring us to really step up our game in understanding basic IT communication. It used to be enough that we could meter out or scope out a MSTP trunk and call it a day. But nowadays we're working with IP. We're having to deal with stuff at the subnet level, stuff above the subnet, routing, port forwarding, switching, all that fun stuff. So there's this thing called the OSI model, and we've hammered it a lot in past episodes. And it essentially is a model for networked communication from the physical layer all the way to the application layer. There's ultimately what's happening whenever you're communicating, whether it's a BAS device, whether it's a web server, whatever it is an application. It's some form of code that is generating some form of communication request, and that communication request being sent to another application where it will then use some form of code to process that communication request. And that OSI model basically explains that entire process. It's a really valuable model for you to understand around communication. And when it really clicked for me, that's when I really started to understand networking, and networking just became easy. And over the years, I've done a lot of network designs, done network designs for hospitals, done complex network layouts, network troubleshooting, and everything in between. And I'll tell you that after doing all of that, realized that there's a lot there that you don't need to know. So let's first focus in on the first layer of the OSI model, which is known as the physical layer. Now, what does that mean? What is the physical layer? Well, the physical layer is the actual network wiring, the actual bits that are coming across the wire, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Remember when I was getting my master's degree in information systems, and we had to take this course, and it had this book that bored the tears out of me at the time, but when I went back and looked at it, realized it was actually really valuable. It went through all the different aspects of bit signaling. Does a 1 mean, or does a high signal on electrical communication mean a 1, or does it mean a 0? All this stuff, bit rates, everything in between. And what I've learned from that is that the communication, how it happens, it's pretty much the same as far as we need to be concerned from a BAS perspective. There's only a couple things we can mess up when it comes to the physical layer. And I'm going to go through those real quick, and then we're going to just dive into what the physical layer is. So some of these are not going to make sense to you until we go at the end of the episode and kind of recap on them. But there's really only a couple. And one is, with wiring, making sure the wires are properly terminated. I mean, that's kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised how many times wires aren't properly terminated by your installers. And because of that, when I say wires, I'm talking about Ethernet network cables typically. Those wires aren't properly terminated. That causes bad communication, causes all sorts of issues. And the other issue is around bandwidth, and we'll talk about that as well. Cables can only carry so many bits across them at a time, and if you do too many bits, then the cables can't communicate. You start to have issues. All right, so what is this thing called the physical layer? Well, it consists of a series of devices that communicate between each other. And in the networking world, you have network devices and you have hosts. So our supervisory devices, our IP field controllers, those are hosts. If you're talking to an IT person, those are hosts. Those are hosts that need host addresses. So all of our stuff is hosts. And they're connected to the network via a networking device, typically a switch. For those of you that talk about hubs and things like that, I can't think of anyone in their right mind who installs a hub anymore, to the point where I'm not even going to cover what hubs are because it's just a waste of your time. We have really two ways we connect to the network, and those are switches that are managed and switches that are unmanaged. You may have heard those terms before and really wondered what the heck that even meant. You're like, what is an unmanaged switch versus a managed switch? What does that mean? Well, if you think about that blue, 4 or 5 port Linksys that pretty much all of us carry in our backpacks, that is an unmanaged switch. There is no way of managing that switch. Basically, that switch, you plug in your network cables into that switch, and that switch then sets up the communication and it works. Whereas a managed switch, you can go and assign VLANs to ports, you can go and manage port settings, you can do all sorts of stuff, and we're not going to get into that until the next episode where we talk about kind of switches and data links and all that jazz. But unmanaged port switches are what we are mostly going to be working with as BAS professionals when we are putting in a switch. Those are typically the 5-port switches that we put into panels. Those are typically the switches that we carry along with us when we want to configure a supervisory device, but we don't want to try to connect to the IT network. Now, managed switches, those are the switches that sit in the data closets, right? Those are those Cisco or Juniper 48-port switches. Don't worry if you don't know what a port means yet. We'll get there. But those are those switches that are managed, usually managed by IT or some outsourced service provider, okay? So then those switches make up what are called subnets. Typically, sometimes they'll have multiple subnets on a switch. Don't worry, once again, if you don't know what subnets are and VLANs and stuff like that, we'll be covering that when we move to layers, which I think will be 2 episodes from now. But you've got these routers, and these routers connect the switches. And so if you were to look at it from a topology, that's a layout perspective, that's what topology means. Topology is a logic. You can actually have physical or logical topology. So physical topology is how things are actually physically laid out. It's the physical structure. Whereas logical topology is how things are logically laid out. So oftentimes when you have subnets, you may have a physical topology that looks different than a logical topology because a subnet may stretch across multiple physical topologies. And if you're like, what the heck did Phil just say? Don't worry. Once again, we'll be covering this in depth in these next couple episodes as well as this one. And we also have BAM TV episodes where we're going to be kind of drawing through this. And if you don't want to kind of figure this out on your own, we have a full-blown course on IT that spends a ton of time on networking. So with that being said, right, those are our devices. Now our devices, as was mentioned, they need to connect to our hosts and they need to connect to each other. And they do this via links. And so each of our devices, our switches, our hosts, and our routers all have ports. Now, this throws a lot of BAS folks for a loop at first when they hear ports, because we're taught, BACnet over IP, UDP port 47808, and that is a application port. That is a logical construct, meaning it does not actually exist. It's logical. It's software. When we're talking about ports at the physical layer, we're talking about physical ports. There's these things called RJ45 heads. They're basically terminal connectors that go on the end of a 8-wire an 8-conductor wire of Ethernet cable. And this Ethernet cable has 8 conductors. It terminates into these RJ45 heads, and that RJ45 plugs in to a port on a switch, on a host, on a router. Okay? Now, if that link, that cable length, connects to networking devices, that is typically called a trunk link. And a trunk link allows data, traffic from multiple VLANs to travel across. Now, you also have what are called access links. I was like thinking to myself for a second, switch port access. This is going back into Cisco memories. But no, you have what are called access links. And the real simple way to remember this is access links enable your host, your supervisory devices, your IP controllers to access the network. Typically, this will be a Cat5 cable running from the network interface card with your port on it, on your host device, your supervisory device, your IP controller, and running from that to the port on the switch. And then both of the ends of the Ethernet cable have RJ45. Now, we're not going to be talking about wireless because I can guarantee you're going to have wired on pretty much every job. I can also guarantee you're not going to have wireless on almost every job. You'll have it on some jobs, but not every job. So let's cover the things you're going to have on every job. And then, if you want to dive into wireless, things like that, once again, check out our course on IT and you can learn about what you need to know about wireless. That being said, so the wiring connects the devices using cabling, in this case, typically Ethernet cabling with RJ45 heads on it. Now, there is things like fiber, multi-mode fiber, single-mode fiber. Those are typically used for trunk links between networking devices. But for our focus, we're focused on the access links and we're focused on host devices connecting to the network. Now, you may feel like I'm using a lot of unfamiliar terms. This may be uncomfortable to you, and that's by design. It's by design that using very much IT speak, because one of the biggest challenges we face as BAS professionals is being comfortable going into a room with IT, sitting down and having a conversation like what I'm having with you right now. That's really when I was able to step up my game with IT folks. And that really provided some great value for me in my career. That made me the go-to person, and it will make you the go-to person, because folks will want to have you interacting with IT because it's uncomfortable. They're speaking a different language. So throughout these lessons, I'm going to be speaking to you throughout these lessons. Can you tell I'm in course creation mode? I've been creating a lot of courses lately. So there's just, we have a lot on our roadmap and we've been doing a lot. And because of that, I've just got my mind there. But I'm going to be speaking to you throughout these episodes very much in IT speak, because this IT speak is going to start to seep into your brain. When you go and talk with IT folks, you'll be able to speak the lingo. That will give you credibility. They'll open up. You'll be much more likely to get what you need done. A lot of times we complain about IT. We say IT doesn't work with us, It's because, one, usually they don't understand what we need because we don't understand what we need. And two, we're speaking a different language, which kind of destroys credibility, especially when we misuse terms. That's the quickest way to destroy credibility with anyone, is to go and be misusing terminology. All right, so we talked about wiring, we talked about Ethernet. Now, communication. When it comes to the physical layer, we're not at layer 2 yet. We're not at the data link, okay? But when it comes to the physical layer, we are focused on a couple things. First off, we need to realize how communication happens on wiring. And this is important solely for the fact of understanding why your BAS data may not get through. Now, some folks will tell you need to understand half duplex versus full duplex and all that jazz. You don't need to know that. All you need to know is the data capacity of the wire you're using. And quite honestly, you don't need to really understand the data capacity of the access link. The reality is, despite all this hype about data velocity, and we've got more data than we ever had before, and yada yada, and you need to put in these super networks to handle all this BAS data, that's a load of crap. That's just trying to sell you stuff. The reality is, your BAS IP controller is not a Netflix streaming service. It's not communicating 4K video across the access link. So your network cabling from your devices to the switches does not constrain your communication. Anyone who's telling you this doesn't know what they're saying, or they are trying to upsell you on something that you don't need. Now, there is some truth, however, that these switches these days, if you are not using dedicated switches for your BAS devices, there is a possibility that someone could plug in a 4K camera into a switch port. There is a possibility that someone could have a host, have a laptop hooked up to that switch and be watching Netflix or watching ESPN or whatever. And that then could take your upstream data from that switch. That's the data going out the trunk link from the switch, most likely to a router. And there you could be what is called bandwidth constrained. Now, bandwidth, if you think of your Ethernet cables as a pipe, and even your fiber cables, if you think of them as a pipe, and water is flowing through this pipe, and water is data. Well, as you start to get more and more water in the pipe gets filled, and then the switch, being a smart switch, says, man, I can't process all this data. I'm going to look at what data is important, and the data that's not important, I'm going to cast aside. But the data that is important, I'm going to let through. And that is what happens when you're seeing network constraints. And I've seen this a couple times. It's not as common as folks make it out to be. But I've seen it a couple times where there's database backups or there's streaming or whatever going across trunk links, and that's eating up all your bandwidth, and your BAS data is being dropped because typically BAS data is looked at as low priority. With that being said, though, that is the exception to the rule. Now, I will agree with the kind of IoT marketing on one aspect, which is that as we continue to add more and more smart devices, as 4K cameras become more consistent, as we start to go and communicate much more data across our trunk links, there is the possibility of causing bandwidth constraints at the higher levels of your switching. So not at your edge, as it's called, but more so at the core or at the distribution layers. And if you're like, what are those? Don't worry. When we get to IP, we'll talk through access, distribution, and core, which is basically the 3-tier network structure model. Man, I bet you all didn't think that you were going to get this kind of education tuning into the podcast episode today. But this is what you need to know going in to a career in BAS. I mean, reality is we're just starting to tap into IP controls. And the things that are going to be coming down the pipe are just going to be so much more intensive. I mean, HVAC, it's easy to learn. I mean, sorry if I insult some of you who are, take pride in how hard it was to learn HVAC, but what we need to learn in BAS, HVAC-wise, is not that hard. I mean, we're not changing motors. We're not out there we're not even changing filters or fan belts. We're sitting there just controlling stuff. So the level of HVAC we need to understand is more sequence and operational, not install. However, we are going to be working in depth with IT, databases, cloud, IP controls, remote access, distributed processing through edge controllers, things like the EasyIO product and similar products like them, where they're putting a lot of the compute and storage and everything at the edge. You're going to need to know this stuff. All right, I'll get off my soapbox there. But as we mentioned, we have bandwidth. Now, thing is, if you increase network speed, you're going to increase the amount of bits going across the wire, a bit being an electrical signal, basically an on-off signal, a digital signal, a high or a off, so 1 or a 0. And as that goes across the wire, the rate at which that goes across the wire is known as speed. And you increase the speed, you consume the bandwidth. Now here's the deal. We aren't doing gigabit speed from our BAS devices, so we really also don't have to worry about that. However, there is the possibility that in the future we could be using higher speed, and this mainly has ramifications for how we go and create our BAS networks. Now, what I mean by that is right now, if I were to ask one of you, how do you future-proof the network links between your BAS IP controllers and your switches? And if you are going and doing what are called OT networks, operational technology networks, instead of IT networks, information technology networks, meaning you're installing your own network switches, things like that. If you're doing that, are you putting any thought and planning into future capacity of trunk links, of access links, things like that? Because if you're using Cat5 and you're using cable that maybe has 10 megabits or 100 megabits, and you're not future-proofing with cable that has better bandwidth capacities, better speed capacities, then you're going to find yourself in a situation potentially where you can go and have these installed cables that are not able to meet the communication speed. Now, granted, I will tell you that the likelihood of this happening right now is not very high. However, there is the possibility that if you are using switching and then somehow this becomes a smart building and you start plugging cameras and things like that into it, there's the possibility that down the road your wiring could not handle the data throughput required. This is a slim chance, but it's still something you need to be aware of, especially if you're using existing network wiring for your BAS devices. So just be cognizant of that. So we talked about throughput, bandwidth, speed, bits, signaling, etc. So the last thing that I'll leave you with in this episode is just kind of a discussion, right? So we go and we put in these IP controllers. We go and we put in these BAS servers. We hook them up with an Ethernet cable. And then we hook them up to a switch. We make sure that that switch has the port turned on, so that way our devices can communicate. And then our devices start a process, which we will cover in the next episode, to communicate with one another on the local subnet. Now, I realize we didn't cover subnets, we didn't cover VLANs, we didn't cover IP addresses, MAC addresses, all of that stuff. That is on purpose. Focus in on when you come out of this, right? We said there's kind of two issues. One is wiring things up properly using the right termination, and the other is bandwidth. So we've covered what both of those are. But coming out of this, want you to realize three things. One is that when it comes to wiring, when it comes to Ethernet, when it comes to the physical layer, we are using ports, and those ports are physical ports that we connect the wires to. We connect our wires using typically RJ45 heads for Ethernet, and we use an Ethernet cable, and that connects our host to the network. Usually we're connecting our host to a switch. There's two types of switches, unmanaged and managed switches. Unmanaged switches you can't configure, managed switches you can configure. And the last thing I want to leave you with here is the concept of bandwidth, that if you're tying into an existing network and for whatever reason your BAS data is not getting through, you could potentially have bandwidth issues, in which case you want to use Wireshark to go and troubleshoot those. I know we just dumped a lot in your lap. This was a lot of concepts to take in, a lot of terminology that may not be familiar to you. Totally understand that. What I highly recommend you do is you go and you check out our Information Technology for BAS Professionals course. It is an entire BAS bootcamp focused on networking, servers, databases, remote access, cybersecurity, network troubleshooting, tons of exercises, and everything in between. If you were to go and physically travel to just a networking boot camp, you would pay $2,000 to $3,000 for the class, plus travel, plus time off work. This course isn't even close to that in cost. Really encourage you to check it out. We've had a ton of students go through it, and it has dramatically changed their career, taking their IT requests from weeks and months down to days, and sometimes even the same day. Just completely changing how successful they are with IT and future-proofing their career, because now they understand what the future of building automation is. So everything we've discussed, including the timestamps, including the link to the Information Technology for BAS Professionals course, can be found at buildingautomationmonthly.com/119. Once again, that is buildingautomationmonthly.com/119. So thanks a ton for being here in this episode. Really looking forward to seeing your feedback and comments. Also, if you wouldn't mind going and leaving us a review on iTunes, ideally, that's how folks find out about the show. It really helps. And we'll look forward to talking to you in the next episode where we're going to be diving into data links. We're going to go through how all of the communication on a local subnet works, and we're going to dive into what you need to know as a BAS professional. Thanks a ton for being here. Can't wait to talk to you again in the next episode. Take care.